Hello and welcome. You're watching NDTV Profit, and this is a very special episode of Profit Insights. I'm seated here with Mr. R Dinesh. You know him better as the Executive Chairman of TVS Supply Chain Solutions, but he's also the President of Confederation of Indian Industries. So very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us on this very special episode.
Thank you, Janani. Thank you, and a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted this conversation to help us touch up on some of the important topics of the economy, its report card per se, and how things are going about in the context of the summer elections of 2024. It is a very interesting time in our country's history, also globally, a period of elections. On that note, first, home base, let's touch upon some of the important topics. Inflation per se. We do not see perhaps an inflection point yet in the rate cut or perhaps a change in the rate trajectory. What is your picture at the beginning of this financial year for the year to come, inflation trajectory and food inflation in particular? Does that concern you with the heat wave we're having?
So actually, inflation has been very well managed by India, I would say, and a big credit to the Reserve Bank of India, because we have actually found that compared to the rest of the world, we have come out much better, right? That's number one. Number two, is that a matter of concern? No. Is that something which we should continuously watch out for? Yes, 100%. And as you rightly said, I think climate change does create, very, I would call it episodic interventions, and we need to be very careful and watch out that for, both from industry and as the common man. But having said that, I think the inflation in itself and as you said, the impact it has on the world economy is something which will impact India as well. So these are the three factors in inflation which I think we will need to continue to watch out for. But having said that, seeing our track record, I believe that is not a big area of concern for industry. We do believe we will manage it and manage it well.
When do you see that inflection point maybe when things could change in 2025?
So I will only quote from the survey which we have had of our members. And the feedback or the expectation is that by Q2 of FY25, we should actually start seeing I would call it coming back to a reduction. And we hope that both the monsoon and all the other factors would play in our favor to make that happen. So that's the expectation today from our survey which we do with our members.
Okay. Because it's the beginning of the financial year, I also want to sort of look back and see what are some of those lessons from FY24 that you're carrying on as you begin the economic report card and the trajectory for FY25. What is something you'll pick up and take forward?
No, I think 23-24 was obviously a great year in terms of the percentage of growth. And I think many of the actions which have taken place, not just in the last year, but in the past in terms of laying I would call it the ground for a more optimistic future is a big plus for us when we look at 24-25. I think the big lessons are that we will need to continue to focus on the cost of doing business and to a great extent the infrastructure which has happened both from the physical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure is something which is going to help us going forward. The last but not the least is that as we look at this ability to have inclusive growth, especially the MSMEs coming on board, etc., I think in 24-25 we believe that there will be even more opportunities for them to become globally integrated with the supply chains and create new opportunities.
One thing that perhaps didn't go as planned was exports, and you are an industry body. And from that perspective, export growth was not as expected. There were a lot of geopolitical shocks, a lot of fragmentation that we're dealing with. So an external supply chain shock is something now that we are forecasting, we're featuring into all our forecasts going forward. What it has been a year for exports, Indian exports in particular, and how do you see this sort of pivoting, if at all, in this year?
So that's a very good point, and I think that's actually the biggest, I would call it, uncertainty in the even our own growth prospects as we look at it, which is what is going to happen geopolitically, right? And both from being part of now India being part of the global supply chains, and even from our normal export story itself, these get impacted very suddenly, and therefore I think we are in a very volatile world. And many of the events which took place last year, which affected, including, for example, the Red Sea shipping crisis, etc., were all something which, at the beginning of the year, if you had asked any of us, we would not have even thought about it or talked about it. Therefore, these are things which we will need to be prepared for. And I think the good news is Indian industry has become more, I would call it, very resilient in terms of finding solutions around it. So some things you can be prepared for, some things you need to be have a contingency plan in place as to various events taking place. But are we positive about exports? Yes, 100% we are. And I think as we go down this path of becoming even more competitive from the India context, that gives us better opportunities, and I would call it even more avenues of growth from an export perspective.
Do you see any particular sectors that could perhaps this be a good year for when we say export specifically? Because it's like you said, it's been a year of uncertainties. Does your sort of insights and research surveys reveal advantages to any particular few sectors?
Not necessarily advantages to a few sectors, but the traditional sectors where we have been strong, whether it be the components or whether it be the leather exports, etc. All of it we are continuing to see positive sentiments from our member companies. Okay. But I think there are some opportunities or new opportunities as we become more competitive from this product manufacturing, which I think we will see even greater push forward too. And of course, where our strengths have been on some of these commodities as well, that continues. I think the advantage which I see today is that India is looked at as now integral to any global value chain. So whether it be production support or whether it be buying from India for, I would call it, the correct reasons of both strategic and geopolitical, I think those are all big pluses for us to capitalize on going forward. So generally there is a positive sentiment.
Okay. And perhaps the challenges to industries, when we look at the broader global picture, how ready are we to face that? Say CBAM, that's one thing that we've always had concerns about, because it is not something that really captures the strengths of India and how India goes forward. So is industry ready for that? We've talked a lot about it, but how do you see this?
So I think there are two steps to this. One is Indian industry looking at making sure that we are sustainable and ready for the growth for the future? 100% yes. So that is not a concern for us. But as you rightly said, bringing in, I would call it in a way, a non-tariff barrier of something like this, and of course it is tariff related as well, is not something which from an industry perspective we believe is good for world trade. So if you look at in the CBAM context, I think we are obviously continuing to engage with the government, and we will also look at seeing how we can work to understand this, to understand the impact of this. But in reality, it doesn't mean that Indian industry is going to become non-competitive in itself because of that. So we will continue to find solutions and workarounds to make that, create more opportunities.
That optimism is definitely one part of India growth story, I would say. One last question before I sort of shift bases on the home front, which is consumption and how rural demand is shaping up. You're no stranger to the integrity of that, how integral this rural economy is and what it means for the larger economy. I don't want to give alphabets to the kind of recovery that's happening. But do you see signs of this changing? Because the institutions of authority have told us that, this could be that year where we will slowly see rural demand picking up. Do you share that sentiment, and what could be the tailwinds to this?
So if you go back and look at what happened post-COVID, I think we should not forget that we are coming out of a very large crisis, right? And yes, obviously we hope that next year will be the year in which this change will take place. But in reality, the ground level, I think we do believe that we are seeing some green shoots. Okay. So yes, I think there is much more optimism when it comes to how the rural economy will grow. And as you again said, it is not that there is no growth. It is that the rate of growth may be higher in some places and not so high in other places, right? So if I step back and look at it as optimism, yes. When and how, I think I don't want to hazard a guess. But in net, our belief is that rural economy is not suffering, but we will actually see even more growth taking place.
Do you think maybe it's the second half is an H2 discussion or an H1, maybe quarter 2 discussion?
Quarter 2 discussion is how I think the surveys show.
Okay. shifting focus now to what the industry wants and how it's been perceived. Private capex is one I wanted to touch up on. We've gotten a lot of clarion calls from the ministry. We're also seeing the base effect take place when it comes to capex expenditure. Green shoots, yes, visible in maybe cement, in steel. What other sectors do you think will pick up the baton when it comes to private sector capex?
See, first and foremost, it is not that private sector capex is not happening, right? Because if you look at the percentage of total capex which is being spent on private sector capex is happening, that percentage is remain more or less the same. And I don't have the data for 23, 24, so I don't want to give that number. I don't know it. But in 22, 23, for example, it was 36.7% or something like that. So that I think will remain there. It is not going to be that the percentage of total spend of the total capex is coming down. But having said that, I think the important point is the capacity utilization and the strength of the balance sheets of the companies. So if I look at both, and some sectors, like you said, cement and steel, yes, definitely. But if you look at automotive components, if you look at a few other sectors, chemicals, many of them have said they are now crossing 90% capacity utilization. So you are coming to a situation where between 75 to 90 is what I would call as a sweet spot for people to invest. So I think it's a question of time rather than, it's a question of when rather than if, right?
Okay.
So it is not one sector. I think in almost all sectors we see that happening. And therefore it's, I think, a question of time and how quickly it happens.
Okay. On that note, in terms of corporate profitability, and this has been also a very different year for corporate taxes, I would say. There was some hesitancy we saw in the initial quarters in terms of how exactly in quarter one. And majoritarily, surprisingly, in fact, personal income taxes have outstripped the pace of growth, at least when it comes to corporate taxes. We saw that the revised estimates also was not changed. It's still at 9.22 lakh crores. We're yet to get the final mop up the figure from the government. How do you think corporate profitability has stood? And, as a reflection to corporate taxes, do you think there's a slowdown, if at all?
As I said, as you said, I don't want to hazard a guess of what it is going to be. None of our surveys have actually showed any negative.
Okay.
So let me put it that way. And actually the expectation or the feedback for 24-25, as I said, the first half of H1 of 25 is very positive. So I don't see that right now as being a challenge.
Okay. All right. On the employment front, we recently had the India employment report come about, and I think the government, the chief economic advisor who launched the report, he said something about how there's only so much the government can do in terms of giving a facilitative environment. It is the for-profit companies that have to hire more. This comes at a time when we're seeing very low GCC hiring. We're seeing ITES, a very different scenario playing out. Are there some sectors that could perhaps take up more hiring? How do you see that picture shaping for the year to come?
Very good question. So I think there are three elements to this. First is, I think, the aspiration of people and the kind of jobs they want. And I think that has also changed quite dramatically. The second issue is what kind of skills and education they wish to undergo, and I think you would have seen the spending data from households, and education and transport have actually significantly improved for people because they are actually wanting to are aspiring to have a better education and better skills available. So in that background, if you look at sectors where we see significant growth possible, I think many service sectors, tourism, it has grown significantly. Hospitality has grown significantly in the last year. If you look at logistics as a sector, that has grown significantly. And they are all large employment sectors, right? And even healthcare. And wherever there is, I would call it a need for people, and the support to those sectors are the ones where we believe that there is going to be significant opportunity for increasing employment.
Coming down to my last few questions, and of course we're in election mode, so one thing that I want to understand is what are some things that whatever government comes to power now would have to keep in mind in terms of the pulse of the industry? What is the industry looking for?
See, from an industry perspective, obviously we want the high growth to continue, and we want it to be an inclusive growth. And for us, I think there are 3-4 broad themes which I think we are focusing on. One is the fact that we want some of the big ticket reforms to be looked at, land, labor, and to a certain extent agriculture. And for that, a consensus to be built, not with the states, to make that happen. And I think one of the suggestions which we had given was that we could have a GST-like structure where the center and the states could come together to debate on this and make it
a federal structure.
Federal structure to make it happen and implement it, right, for the implementation side of it. The second side of it is the MSMEs. So if you look at their support for that, for support for their growth, which already is being done with, for example, the ECGLS scheme, we can actually get it formalized into a kind of a first loss fund and then help them in their growth journey, both from a capex and a working capital perspective. The second side of it is for them to be supported for the green transition, so that, making sure they are not affected as the changes take place in that portfolio. And the last, which is a very important point, is for them to be able to get the digital journey completed and any funding support for them, right? So this is two common themes. If you look at cutting across, then it is focusing on the social spend, which is, both from education and healthcare, and making sure that you have the support for the inclusive growth, which is to make women more employable. And finally, startups. So we want, I would call it, the 3-4 broad themes to be covered by all the political parties, and we believe there is consensus on those.
I want to, sort of expand on one of the themes that you said on MSMEs. I think it has been an interesting year, working capital-wise, when the 45-day payment rule became a mandate. That, there is no two ways about it. This financial year, it will go on. And CII also spoke very positively that it wanted this to happen sooner rather than later. What are some other pertinent things for MSMEs in terms of making an enabling ecosystem that needs to come about?
So in fact, one of the things, so it's what you say is very correct. Obviously, we have been saying to all our members that it's good and necessary for all the large corporates to support the MSMEs, because they are actually creating a cost competitiveness for India as well in the way in which they operate. The other thing which we are speaking about is to create a formal mechanism of a better rating support for them, because MSMEs have a very different rating approach from large corporates, and they don't generally get rated. The CIBIL rating is the one which they go to. So if we can really get a mechanism of rating, which then allows them to access funds, both from the formal sector or through the fintech sector, that then creates a better opportunity for them to be able to grow. And that's one of the recommendations which we are making, to make sure that they get more access to formal sector funding.
A similar question, in fact, the government now is locking down on building up a mission mode, a 100-day of governance agenda. The first 100 days of whichever government comes to power, what kind of things all ministries are contributing. What is something you'd like to see on that? You have mentioned a couple. Is there something else you would like to add on to that you would like to see?
Nothing right now. In fact, we are actually putting together a comprehensive document. So maybe that will be something I'll have a separate conversation.
I wanted to ask you also if there's a tax wish list, that if at all some tax necessities, because a July budget is something, it was an interim budget before. There was no big this thing, and we didn't see big tax announcements come about. But on the wish list of the industry is something.
Because
okay.
I think we will wait for June before we come back on that.
Okay. And on a broader, I think this is coming down to my last two questions. When we look at the international perspective and right now the political economy and the way it stands, we've seen a white paper come about which spoke at length about the years of regime. How would you chronicle, sort of, if we were to work on a white paper for the industry and how things have been, what would you see has been the highlight now in a post-COVID year and going forward?
So I think first and foremost, I think India has actually arrived on the global world stage. And I think both as industry and as I would call it a competitive economy, I think we have been well recognized, well understood and well accepted across the world. And I think as president this year, I've been going around to many of these countries. And actually you see the kind of response is now not about, should I invest in India? No more that question is asked at all. It is all about, when and how and which state, etc. Those kind of discussions are taking place. And we are talking about very large ticket discussions, right? The second is, I think the fact that India has become very cost competitive. So if I look at our positioning from the world, I think the domestic demand and that we are competitive is now well understood. So I am very optimistic, and I would call it looking forward to the future in terms of how that pans out, in terms of just not being integrated into global supply chains, but also significant investment taking place for India and for the world from India. So I think that's, I would call it a big strength. And I think the last comment I'll make here is our big differentiation is in digital public infrastructure. We have actually managed to, because considering the size and the population of the country, I think to be able to scale this up to this level is again a big plus, which is well understood across the world. And also, maybe I'll add one more last statement to it. I think the world is now also looking for talent from India for certain skills, because there are a shortage of people. Like I was in Japan recently, and they have now announced this scheme where people can come for 3 to 5 years, work there, and then come back. So these are all opportunities which I think will place India in the world stage in an even better manner.
One forward-looking, and this is my last question. In terms of the challenges that you face domestically, it has also been a year of a lot of tax notices for a lot of companies. It has been a year of a lot of changes, I would say. Ending of the year is always that moment of a little anxiety. Challenges that you see perhaps for a regulatory environment, it could be made easier for industries.
No, I think CII as a general rule has always been saying decriminalization of legislation is important. And I think this government did understand that very well. This work in progress. And we believe that we will continue to push for making that happen in the future as well.
All right. Very many thanks for an engaging conversation with us. Thank you. It was a pleasure having you on our show.
Thank you. Pleasure as myself.
Thank you. You've been watching NDTV Profit. Stay tuned as we bring you more such content on this particular show, Profit Insights.